Okay, so you sent us this really interesting collection of articles all about what's going on with Bitcoin prices recently.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, it's not exactly the easiest picture to make sense of, right? There's a lot going on.
Yeah, it's definitely a mixed bag.
It is. So what we're going to do in this deep dive is really unpack these sources, go through them carefully.
Absolutely.
And pull out the key insights that you need to know.
Yeah, I think there are some really important takeaways in here for sure.
Yeah. So by the end of this, you should have a much clearer understanding of, what the sentiment is like around Bitcoin right now.
Right.
We're going to talk about the possibility of, could the price actually dip? And if so, by how much?
Yeah.
And we'll look at the factors that everyone's watching really closely.
Exactly. You've shared a range of news articles here.
Yeah.
We've got stuff from crypto-specific outlets. We've got financial news sites all over the place.
Yeah.
And I think the one thing that really stands out after looking at all of these is there's just a lot of uncertainty right now.
Yeah.
And I think across these sources, there's a significant amount of discussion about the potential for Bitcoin to correct downwards.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are, sort of focusing on that $70,000 level as a possible testing point.
Okay.
So that's sort of the big picture.
All right, so let's unpack that.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, sometimes it helps to start with a story.
All
right?
Yeah.
To really illustrate what we're talking about here. And one of these articles, I think it was dated April 4th, 2025.
Okay.
It talks about this British woman who she accidentally threw away a flash drive.
Oh, no.
Yeah. So now, normally that's a little annoying. Right?
Yeah. You list some files.
Some photos, whatever.
Yeah.
But this flash drive, it held the keys to $3.8 million worth of Bitcoin.
Oh, wow.
Ouch.
So talk about a really bad day.
Yeah, that is. I mean, I think what's so fascinating about that story is that it just underscores, I think, the personal responsibility that comes with owning cryptocurrency, right?
Yeah.
Totally.
I mean, unlike, when you have traditional assets and they're held in a brokerage account or a bank,
right.
The security of your Bitcoin, it often rests entirely in your own hands.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you lose that private key, like in this case, accidentally throwing it away on a flash drive, it effectively means losing access to that fortune. Forever, with no real way to recover it. I mean, it's a devastating loss. And I think it really just highlights a very fundamental risk in the world of crypto that we have to be aware of.
A multi-million-dollar oops moment.
Yeah, really. So let's kind of shift gears a little bit.
Okay.
From that, individual story to the broader market analysis.
Yeah.
A lot of these sources are pointing to a possible price correction for Bitcoin itself.
Right.
And we saw veteran trader Peter Brandt, he shared his perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And he doesn't seem to be too optimistic about at least the immediate future. Yeah. What's interesting is that he was actually responding to some analysis that was put out by this firm called HTLNL.
Okay.
And they had suggested that Bitcoin could potentially fall, either to $76,700 or even down to $70,000.
Okay.
And Brandt's take was that, this shouldn't be seen as some sort of unreasonable expectation.
Right.
And he actually thinks that selling pressure in the market is probably going to increase.
Yeah.
So coming from someone with, his kind of long-standing reputation in trading, that definitely adds weight to the bearish outlook.
Absolutely, yeah. And he's not the only one. We've got Arthur Hayes, the founder of BitMEX.
Oh, right, yeah.
He's also, expressing caution. He's actually putting a 60% probability on Bitcoin correcting down to 70,000.
Wow, that's a pretty substantial likelihood. I mean,
yeah.
Coming from someone with his experience, I mean,
right.
He knows the cryptocurrency exchange world inside and out.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty strong statement.
So what is it that's making people feel so, hesitant?
Yeah.
What's driving this?
Yeah, it's not just a hunch, right?
Right.
I mean, these analysts are pointing to specific factors that they believe are going to put downward pressure on the price.
Okay.
And, one example, we had Timothy Peterson.
Okay.
He's a network economist. And he actually issued a pretty strong warning. I mean, he suggested that Bitcoin could revisit its 2021 all-time high of $70,000.
Wow.
Within just 10 days.
Okay.
And he even called this level a potential practical bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And he based this on, his own metric. He calls it the lowest price forward,
right,
or the LPF. And he was also looking at, how previous bear markets have played out.
Right.
So I mean, that's a pretty precise and understandably concerning prediction for a lot of people.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, so let's dive into these factors. What's making everyone so cautious, nervous, whatever. And there are a few key areas that were highlighted in these articles. And one that seems to be really prominent is this whole uncertainty around the U.S. personal consumption expenditures. We often call it the PCE. It's, inflation data.
Right. Yeah, the PCE data, I mean, that's a really critical piece of the puzzle because it's one of the main indicators that the Federal Reserve looks at when they're making decisions about monetary policy.
Yeah.
Like things like interest rate hikes or cuts.
Right.
And so any surprises in that data, especially if inflation is higher than expected, that can create a lot of volatility in the markets. And higher inflation could push the Fed to take a more, hawkish stance, which is generally seen as a negative for riskier assets like Bitcoin.
Right.
And I think even just the uncertainty itself makes investors more cautious.
Sure.
They're less willing to take risks when they don't know what's going to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. We also saw a reaction, and a pretty notable one, I think, to these trade tariffs that President Trump announced.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And, this was on April 2nd.
Okay.
And he announced these higher than expected U.S. trade tariffs.
Right.
And it seems like Bitcoin reacted pretty negatively to that news, maybe even more so than U.S. stocks.
Yeah, that's interesting. It might suggest that Bitcoin is even more sensitive to, global economic policy and this overall appetite for risk.
Okay.
I mean, tariffs, they just create uncertainty about future economic growth and the relationships between countries when it comes to international trade.
Right.
And in that kind of environment, I think investors might view Bitcoin as a more speculative asset.
Right.
And they might want to reduce their exposure to that compared to something like stocks, which are, a little bit more established.
Yeah, a little more predictable, maybe.
Maybe. Yeah.
So then we have the Philadelphia Fed Business Outlook Survey, the BOS.
Right.
And this painted a sort of concerning picture, I'd say.
Yeah.
Of how businesses are feeling about the future.
Oh.
So they actually put their expectations in a range similar to high-risk periods like 2000, 2008, and 2022.
Wow. Okay, so those aren't exactly years that anyone wants to revisit.
Yeah, I think we'd all prefer not to.
Yeah.
Economically, I mean.
Yeah. I mean, the fact that business expectations are this low at the same time as these tariff announcements,
right.
I mean, that suggests that there's real concern about the direction of the economy.
Yeah.
And that kind of uncertainty, it naturally has a ripple effect.
Of course.
It influences investor behavior across different asset classes, and crypto is not immune to that.
Absolutely not. Okay, so we're also seeing some interesting signals, I think, coming from what we call on-chain data.
Okay.
Specifically, there's been a decrease in Bitcoin futures open interest.
Uh-huh.
And overall trading volume has gone down.
Right.
So what can we read into these kinds of movements?
I mean, I think those are definitely indicators of a market that's losing a bit of its conviction, or at least becoming more cautious. So a decrease in open interest in Bitcoin futures, that suggests that fewer new positions are being opened.
Right.
And that can mean that there's just less enthusiasm or certainty about where the price is going to go in the future.
Got it.
And then lower trading volume, that can also just reflect a lack of strong directional momentum.
Okay.
People are just more hesitant to make, big trades.
Sure. Yeah. And it's also worth noting that there's this increasing correlation between Bitcoin and the NASDAQ 100 index.
Oh, right.
Which is, very heavily weighted toward tech stocks.
Yeah.
That feels like a risk, at least in the short term.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, while the long-term narrative for Bitcoin often includes this idea that, it's an asset that's not tied to traditional markets.
Right.
In the short term, we do often see it moving in sync, especially with tech stocks.
Yeah.
So if the NASDAQ takes a downturn, that rising correlation suggests that Bitcoin might very well follow. So it kind of weakens that argument that Bitcoin is a safe haven in the immediate term.
Okay. Let's look at market sentiment through kind of a different lens now.
Okay.
Analysis from Glassnode pointed out that there's been a spike in demand for downside protection.
Okay.
This is in the Bitcoin options market.
Got it.
And they said that put options, which basically allow traders to profit if the price goes down,
right,
those are trading at a higher price than call options.
Right.
Which, of course, allow profit if the price goes up.
Yeah.
And they said that this level of fear, they haven't seen it since mid-2023.
Oh, wow.
So it seems like a pretty clear indicator that a lot of traders are expecting or at least preparing for potential price declines.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's notable there is that it reflects, a real concern about the price actually going down.
Yeah.
Traders are willing to pay a premium for those put options.
Right.
As a kind of insurance.
Like a hedge, yeah.
Yeah. Against potential losses.
Exactly.
And it just indicates that, there is this prevailing expectation.
Yeah.
Or at least a very active hedging strategy that's focused on the possibility of a downturn.
Yeah.
And I think the comparison to mid-2023, when Bitcoin was trading at much lower levels,
right,
that really underscores the level of anxiety, I think, that's out there.
Yeah, absolutely. But, it's rarely a one-sided story.
Oh, of course not, yeah.
In the market.
Yeah.
And so these articles, they also present some counter arguments.
Right.
Potential scenarios where Bitcoin might actually rebound.
Yeah, and I think that's crucial to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
I mean, the market is hardly ever in complete agreement about anything.
Right.
And so for example, we have Javon Marks.
Okay.
And he's actually maintained a long-term bullish outlook, even suggesting a potential move up to the 116,600 to 118,800 range.
Wow.
Based on, patterns that he sees in the market historically. So, I mean, that's a pretty different view.
Huge contrast, yeah.
Yeah, huge contrast to some of those bearish predictions we were just talking about.
Right. And we have Michael Van de Poppe. He's been observing that there seems to be buying pressure that's absorbing dips in the price.
Right.
Which suggests that there is underlying demand, at least at certain levels.
Exactly. And if we see that, consistently, that buyers are stepping in to purchase Bitcoin whenever the price drops a little bit.
Yeah.
That can indicate that there's a level of strong support there.
Right.
And that not everyone's convinced that a major downturn is inevitable.
Yeah, for sure. And technical analyst Kurt Van Lagen, he offered a very optimistic perspective.
Okay.
He actually sees the current price action as a retest of what's called an inverted head and shoulders pattern.
Okay.
With a long-term target of 300,000.
Wow.
So that's a pretty bold prediction based on his technical analysis.
Yeah, so his analysis is based on this idea that he sees a very specific pattern in the price chart, the long-term price chart, and an inverted head and shoulders pattern that's often seen as a sign of a potential bullish reversal.
Okay.
So, a downtrend, and then it reverses and it goes up.
Right.
So his view is that this recent dip, it's just a temporary pullback.
Gotcha.
Before we see prices move significantly higher.
Oh, yeah.
And he did highlight a really key level to watch.
Okay.
He said, if we see a weekly close below 72.9K, that would invalidate his very bullish 300,000 target.
Okay.
So that's an important level to keep in mind.
All right. So something to watch for sure. Now, data from Santiment, they pointed out something pretty interesting.
Okay.
They said that whenever social media mentions of Bitcoin falling below $70,000, whenever that really spikes, it's historically been followed by quick bullish bounce backs.
Interesting.
So could all this fear that we're seeing, could that actually be a contrarian signal?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point about market psychology because, when fear is really widespread and a lot of people are expecting a certain outcome, which in this case is, prices going down. Right. Sometimes the opposite happens. Yeah. Because, these social sentiment indicators, they can be contrarian signals. Right. They might suggest that, when pessimism peaks, that might actually be when a recovery starts. Wow. So it's just a reminder that the crowd isn't always right.
The crowd is not always right. Okay, good to remember. Capriol Investments, they offered a perspective on price levels to watch.
Okay.
They said that if Bitcoin can close above 91,000 on a daily basis, that would be a strong sign that the bullish trend is back.
Okay.
But if that doesn't happen, they think a dip into the 71,000 zone is possible.
Got it.
And that we could see a sizable bounce from there.
Okay, so they're giving us some very specific numbers to watch, which I think is helpful. So 91,000, that's a resistance level. Right. That, if broken, could signal that we're back in a bullish phase. Right. And then 71,000, that's a potential support area. Yeah. Where we might see buyers step in. Yeah. And push the price back up.
Yeah. Okay, so looking beyond the technicals, the sentiment, all that. Right. We have broader economic factors.
Yeah.
And there's been mention of increasing global liquidity.
Okay.
and this coming big M2 influx in the U.S. money supply.
Right.
And historically, this has been good for Bitcoin's price. And one analyst actually predicted that we could see a rebound by early May.
Wow.
Just based on this expectation.
So, I mean, for those who might not be familiar, M2, it's basically a measure of the money supply.
Right.
That includes, cash, checking deposits, and things that are easily convertible to cash.
All right.
And an increase in M2, well, that can sometimes lead to inflation.
Yeah.
And then investors might start looking for assets like Bitcoin to protect their wealth.
The hedge, right.
Exactly.
Okay, so the thinking is that there's going to be more money out there.
Right.
And that could push people towards Bitcoin.
Yeah. And the fact that they've put a timeline on it, early May.
Right.
That's something that people are going to be watching very closely.
Absolutely. So Bitcoin, it reacted negatively initially to the news about those tariffs.
Right.
But it hasn't seen like a huge collapse in price.
Right.
Unlike what we've seen in some equity markets.
Yeah.
So Glassnode actually suggested that this lack of a major breakdown could be a sign that we're near a bottom.
Interesting.
So, while there's definitely fear and uncertainty out there, the fact that Bitcoin hasn't just completely tanked,
right,
despite all this negative news, could indicate that there's, some underlying strength.
Right.
Or that a lot of the selling pressure's already happened.
It's possible, yeah.
So this kind of resilience is actually something that's often seen near market bottoms.
Interesting.
So maybe that's a good sign.
Yeah.
Maybe. We'll see. So let's zoom out a little bit to the wider political and economic context.
Right.
Arthur Hayes, he also offered some interesting thoughts in these articles about what's happening with major central banks.
Okay.
The U.S. Federal Reserve, China's People's Bank of China, the Bank of Japan. So he's really talking about their potential impact on, both Bitcoin and traditional markets.
Yeah, and I think he brings a really valuable macro perspective to this discussion.
Right.
Because when he's analyzing these central bank policies, particularly this tightening of monetary policy that we're seeing in a lot of the world and those rising treasury yields in the US, that really highlights the vulnerabilities that could exist within the traditional financial system.
Right. And he even went so far as to say that the U.S. financial system might be nearing a breaking point.
Wow.
Because of, these rising treasury yields and the massive national debt. That's a pretty serious statement.
Yeah, it is. I mean, his analysis basically suggests that we have this potentially fragile financial system.
Yeah.
And it's under increasing pressure from, growing debt and rising interest rates.
Yeah.
And he argues that the usual things that central banks do to, kind of smooth things over, like quantitative easing, which is basically injecting more money into the system, he thinks those actions could be delayed or maybe less effective this time around.
Okay.
Because of a lot of different political factors.
Right.
And he specifically mentioned, the potential for the Federal Reserve to resist some of the policies that might come out of a Trump administration.
Right.
Even if those policies are seen as, favorable to the crypto market.
Yeah.
So it's this really complex situation.
Yeah.
With all these economic and political forces at play, and that could have a big impact on, all markets, not just Bitcoin.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So given all of this, I mean, there are so many different viewpoints, so many different potential scenarios, so many factors that are influencing things. What are some of the key price levels that you, the listener, should be paying attention to right now?
Okay, so based on what I'm seeing in these articles, there are a few really critical levels.
Okay.
FX leaders, they highlighted $90,000 as a major resistance level.
Okay.
So Bitcoin needs to break above that to signal that, we're back in a bullish trend.
Gotcha.
Okay, so then the Crypto Times, they pointed to potential support levels at $76,430.
Okay.
And $73,827.
Okay.
So those are areas where the price might find some buying interest if it does drop.
Really?
And ultimately, that bearish target could even fall below 70,000.
Right.
So then we have the Crypto Basic. They mentioned 72.9K as a crucial level.
Okay.
That if broken to the downside, if we see a weekly close below that level, that would actually invalidate Gert van Lagen's, that very bullish 300,000 target that he had.
Right.
And they also said that 69,699 is a key support level to watch.
Okay.
And finally, Cointelegraph, they were referencing Capriol Investments.
Right.
They highlighted 91,000 as a bullish reclaim level.
Okay.
And then the 71,000 zone
right.
as a potential area for a bounce.
Right.
So lots of numbers.
Yeah.
But I think those are some important ones to keep in mind.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's kind of sum it all up.
Yeah.
It really seems like we're in a period of just huge uncertainty for Bitcoin.
Yeah.
And this possibility of a price correction down to that $70,000 level,
right.
at least in the short term, that definitely feels more likely now.
Yeah.
And, you've got these concerns about inflation, you've got anxiety around these trade tariffs,
yeah.
and then these broader macroeconomic headwinds that Arthur Hayes was talking about.
Exactly. And we've seen, quite a few analysts and indicators pointing to this potential downside pressure on Bitcoin.
Right.
But I think it's also important to remember that there are contrasting perspectives out there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some analysts, they remain really bullish for the long term.
Yeah.
And they point to, the way the market has behaved historically. They're looking at technical analysis patterns.
Yeah.
And they're thinking about potential future economic factors, like, this increased liquidity that we might see.
Right.
And they say that these are all reasons why Bitcoin could still see a significant rebound.
Absolutely.
So the market is kind of divided right now.
Yeah.
I mean, there are good arguments to be made on both sides.
Okay, so for you, the listener, given all these different perspectives, different factors at play, everything that we've unpacked in this deep dive,
right?
What will be the key indicator that you're watching, to try and figure out what Bitcoin's going to do next? Will it be the inflation data releases? Will it be, how the market continues to react to these trade tariffs?
Yeah.
Will it be those technical price levels that we talked about?
Right.
Or maybe it'll be the signals coming from the options market.
It's a really good question.
Yeah. And we really hope that this deep dive has, helped you to kind of cut through the noise.
Yeah.
And giving you a better understanding of what's going on with Bitcoin right now.
Absolutely.
Based on all this information that you shared with us.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
So what happens next? Well, that's for the market to decide.
Right.
And for you to watch and consider.
I think that's a good place to leave it.
Yeah.
Yeah.